I learned something very early on. Some children are born to be loved, and some exist only to serve as a backdrop for others to shine. Thomas was the radiant light of our family, and I was the leftover. As a child, I often wondered what made him so deserving of all those privileges. Was it because he was a boy, or because he was 4 years older than me? Or was it simply because my parents had long decided that he was more worthy than I was? I never got an answer, only a harsh reality that I had no choice but to accept. Thomas got everything, and I got whatever was left, if anything at all. My parents, Linda and Robert, loved Thomas in a way I had never experienced. I remember sitting at the dinner table in silence, chewing my food while my mother beamed with pride, boasting to my father about Thomas's athletic achievements. If there was a swimming competition, they would hurriedly pack his bags and drive him to the meet, cheering as if he were an Olympic athlete. If there was a soccer match, they would arrive early, waving flags and shouting tirelessly. And me? I was just the quiet girl in the corner, silently arranging my broken crayons, knowing that no one would care if I wanted to learn how to draw. I tried so many times to earn even a sliver of their attention. I got straight A's on all my math tests, but my parents only gave a brief nod before resuming their discussion about Thomas's game strategies. I once painted a beautiful family portrait and excitedly handed it to my mother. But she merely smiled, set it aside, and forgot about it moments later. It wasn't until I was 14 that I finally understood my efforts would never be enough. That day, Thomas received his acceptance letter from Westwood University, a prestigious school my parents had dreamed of for him for years. The moment the letter was opened, my mother screamed with joy, tears welling in her eyes as if this were the most sacred moment of her life. My father clapped Thomas on the back, his voice brimming with pride. "Son, you are the pride of this family." I stood in the kitchen corner, quietly listening as they talked about his future. A few minutes later, I realized they weren't just covering his tuition, they were also buying him an apartment near campus for his convenience. I let out a dry laugh. They never had money to pay for my art classes, but they had money to buy Thomas an apartment. That night, I sat alone in my room, the dim light of my desk lamp reflecting off the certificate I had just received from school, an achievement my parents had never even asked about. Bitterness swelled in my chest, but I didn't cry. I was too used to this feeling. But what hurt me the most wasn't the favoritism, it was the indifference. They didn't hate me, nor did they outright despise me, they simply didn't see me. Perhaps the only reason I survived in that house was because of my grandparents. They were the only ones who truly cared about me, even though they weren't wealthy or power-hungry like my parents. My grandfather owned a small antique shop downtown, a place I often visited whenever I felt lost. My grandmother always welcomed me with a tight hug, and my grandfather always knew how to make me feel like I mattered. One day, when I told them that my parents couldn't afford to send me to art classes, my grandfather simply looked at me in silence, his kind eyes filled with thought. Then he smiled, patted my hand gently, and said, "Catherine, you don't need anyone's permission to chase your dreams. If you truly want something, create it for yourself." I didn't understand his words right away, but a few days later, when he offered me a job at his shop after school so I could earn my own money, I realized that this was his way of teaching me to stand on my own. And that was when I started to change. I stopped waiting for my parents to acknowledge me. I stopped hoping they would see me. I knew that if I wanted something I had to take it for myself. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, if I proved that I was just as valuable, my parents would see me differently. After Thomas left for college, the house became quieter, but the space he left behind was never mine to fill. My parents still talked about him constantly, as if he were still living there. His phone calls became the highlight of their day. My mother would rush to answer, her voice overflowing with happiness every time she heard his voice. My father would always ask about his studies, his friends, his college life, as if nothing in this world mattered more than Thomas's future. And me? I still existed in that house, quietly doing everything like a shadow, invisible in my own home. I never even considered asking my parents for help with tuition. I already knew the answer. But I also refused to give up. I continued working at my grandparents' antique shop, diligently saving every penny for the future I had to build on my own. My days followed the same routine: school in the morning, work in the afternoon, and returning home in the evening to face my parents' indifference. That summer, I received my acceptance letter to Riverside University. It wasn't as prestigious as Thomas's school, but it was the best I could do with the money I had. When I told my parents the news, their reaction was exactly what I had expected. "Oh, is that so?" my mother said, completely devoid of enthusiasm. "Have you figured out how you're going to pay for rent and tuition yet?" I nodded, swallowing the sharp sting in my chest. "I'll use the money I've saved, and I'll keep working to cover the rest of the expenses." Dad flipped the newspaper, not even bothering to look up. Good. Being independent is the right way. I didn't know what I was expecting. A word of praise? A hint of pride? A simple congratulations? But there was nothing. Just a hollow acknowledgement. As if I was merely doing what they had always expected of me, taking care of myself. Because they had never intended to do it for me. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard when, at that very moment, Thomas announced he was struggling with some of his classes, and, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, my parents immediately looked for ways to help him. "Thomas needs a tutor," Mom told Dad at dinner that night. "He's not doing well in finance." Dad sighed but nodded. "I think we can manage. After all, we can't let him fall behind." I gripped my fork tightly. A tutor for Tomas? But when I asked for help buying books, they told me I should just go to the bookstore and read what I needed there. It would save money. I said nothing, just kept eating, ignoring the fury simmering in my chest. But the final straw came in the winter of my second year of college. It was pouring that day. I had just finished my shift at the antique shop and stood at the bus stop, shivering in my old coat. The bus was late, and I was nearly frozen by the time it arrived. When I walked into the house, my clothes were soaked, my hair dripping from the rain. Mom glanced at me, but instead of concern, she just sighed. "Where are you all wet?" she asked. "The bus was late, so I had to wait outside," I replied. "You need a car. Standing out in weather like this is awful." I laughed, excitement bubbling in my chest at her words. "A car?" Dad frowned. "Are you planning to walk everywhere for the rest of your life? You need a car to get around, Catherine." I clenched my hands. "So, can I buy one? If I save up half, can you and Mom help with the rest?" The room fell into tense silence. Mom shook her head. "Catherine, you know we can't afford that for you." I let out a bitter laugh. "But you bought a car for Thomas. When he was 18, you helped him get a brand new sedan." Dad set down his newspaper, his eyes cold. "Don't compare, Catherine. You and Thomas are different. Thomas is your older brother." I met his gaze, my voice trembling with anger. "Different how? Because he's a boy? Because he matters more than I do?" Mom let out an exasperated sigh. "It's not like that, it's just... Back then, Thomas needed it because he had to travel for school. We were able to help, so we did. But now, you have to understand that our financial situation doesn't allow it." I wanted to scream, I wanted to break something, but instead, I just shook my head and walked upstairs. I got it. I didn't need their help, I never had. That night, I opened my laptop and started searching for a used car on online marketplaces. Something cheap, something that could run, nothing fancy like Thomas's. I knew I'd have to work more hours, but I would buy it with my own money. And when I held the keys to my first car in my hands, 3 months later, I didn't feel bitter. I felt proud. I wasn't the child they loved the most. I wasn't the one who got pampered. But I was the only one in this family who could buy my own car. I had once told myself that one day I would prove to my parents that I was worthy of recognition, that I would show them I wasn't any less capable than Thomas. But that was the naive thinking of someone who didn't yet understand the nature of favoritism. And I realized that on the day Thomas graduated from college. They had been planning for months. A lavish party was held at an upscale restaurant booked weeks in advance to celebrate their son. Guests included distant relatives, my father's colleagues, and family friends. Mom hired a private chef to prepare a gourmet menu, and Dad spared no expense in booking a live band for the event. Everything was perfect. For Thomas. I stood in the corner of the room, watching in disbelief as my parents stood in the center, raising their glasses, recounting Thomas's achievements, as if he were the main character of the world. "Thomas is going to have a brilliant future," Dad announced proudly, clapping him on the back before turning to the crowd. "We are so proud of our son." The applause filled the room. People laughed, raised their glasses in celebration, and me? I just gave a small, hollow smile and took a sip of water in silence. No one mentioned me. No one remembered that I was also in college. No one cared that I had worked tirelessly to achieve my own success. But I was used to it. 3 years later, it was my turn to graduate. No fancy restaurant, no large guest list, no proud speech from my parents. Just a simple dinner at home with a small cake my mother had picked up from the supermarket. She placed the cake on the table, forcing a smile. "Congratulations, Catherine. We can't afford a big celebration like we did for Thomas, but what matters is that you finished your studies." I looked at the tiny cake, then at my parents. "Do you know that I graduated at the top of my class?" Mom looked up at me for a second, then resumed cutting the cake. "Oh, really? That's great, dear. That's something to be proud of." But her voice carried no emotion. Dad didn't even react. He just sat in his chair, scrolling through his phone. I swallowed the bitterness in my throat. What had I been expecting? A big party? A speech? A sincere word of praise? I should have known this would happen to me. Shortly after graduation, I received a job offer from a prestigious financial firm. I finally had a real start, a chance to build my own life. But instead of being proud, my parents were focused on something else. "So, what's your plan now?" Mom asked, as I washed the dishes after dinner. I dried my hands and turned to look at her. "I start work next week. But I'm also looking for a place to stay. I want my own space." Mom nodded, then suddenly seemed to remember something. "Tomas's apartment is still vacant. Maybe you could move in there." I looked at her, a flicker of hope rising in my chest. "Really? You'd let me live there?" Mom smiled. "Of course, but you'll have to pay rent to us." I froze. "Rent?" Dad glanced up from his newspaper. "Yes, you have a job now. You can afford it. We can't just leave the apartment empty without someone paying for it." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. Thomas lived there for 4 years without paying a single cent. Why do I have to pay rent? Dad frowned. "Don't compare yourself to Thomas." Mom nodded. "It's a different situation. When Thomas was in college, we were in a better financial position. Now, we're not." I looked at them, feeling a wave of anger rising inside me, but instead of arguing, I just nodded. "Fine. How much?" Mom smiled as if she had just made a great deal. "We'll give you a slight discount from the market rate. Consider it a good start for you." "A good start?" I said nothing, just stayed quiet. I knew arguing wouldn't change anything. I moved into Thomas's old apartment that weekend. From the very first day, I knew I didn't really belong there. His presence was still everywhere, nail holes in the walls from the pictures he had hung, scratches on the floor from the chair he used to sit in. But at least it was my own space. Every month, on time, I sent my parents the rent. I never missed a single payment. But no matter how much I did, it seemed like they would never stop demanding more. One evening, just after I got home from work, Mom called. "Catherine, I think it's time for you to start paying real rent." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been paying exactly what you asked for every month." "That was when you just started working," Mom said lightly. "Now that you're more stable, I think you can afford to pay full market price." I gripped the phone tightly. "Did Thomas ever pay?" There was silence on the other end for a moment before Mom sighed, her voice laced with irritation. Catherine, don't bring up the past. You have a good job now. Paying a little more shouldn't be a problem, right? I took a deep breath. A part of me wanted to argue. But then I realized something. They never saw me as part of the family. I could never change them. All right, I replied, my voice calm. I'll think about it. Mom's call came on a Friday evening, just as I got off work after a long day. Her voice was urgent, but not out of concern for me. Catherine, you need to come home immediately, we have something important to discuss. I frowned. My mother never called just to check in. If she said it was important, it meant it had to do with Thomas. What is it, Mom? I asked, a bad feeling creeping up my spine. She sighed. It's Thomas. He's in trouble. He's lost everything, Catherine. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to process her words. Lost everything? What do you mean? His business went bankrupt. His wife Sarah just gave birth. They have nowhere to go. So. Mom paused for a moment before continuing, her voice firm, almost commanding. We've decided that Thomas and his family will be moving into the apartment you're living in. I gripped the phone tightly, feeling the blood in my veins boil. My apartment? Are you serious? Don't be selfish, Catherine, Mom snapped. Your brother is struggling, he needs a place to stay. You live there alone, there's plenty of space. I let out a bitter laugh. Plenty of space? Do you remember that I pay rent for that apartment? Mom hesitated. Yes, but. I cut her off. So, are they going to contribute? Will they be paying part of the rent? There was silence. Then Mom spoke again, her voice as if she were stating the obvious. No. Thomas is going through a tough time. He doesn't have the money to pay. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I already knew the answer, but that didn't make it hurt any less. And what about me? I asked, my voice ice cold. Do I still have to pay full rent while he and his family live there for free? You have a stable job. Just help out for a while, Mom said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I didn't answer right away. I just felt a deep sense of exhaustion settle in my chest. This was how it had always been? No one asked if I was okay with it. No one cared about what I thought. And I was simply expected to accept it. That weekend, Thomas and his family moved in. They didn't just bring their luggage, they brought with them an air of failure and entitlement. Sarah held their newborn son David, her face tired but still carrying an expression that suggested, I should be grateful they were here. Thomas didn't even look at me. He just dropped his bags on the floor, let out a heavy sigh, and collapsed onto the couch as if he owned the place. Mom stood in the middle of the room, clapping her hands in satisfaction. This is great! The apartment is spacious enough for everyone to live comfortably. I crossed my arms, trying to keep my anger in check. So, they'll be staying in the living room, right? Mom turned to me, her expression filled with disapproval. Of course not, Catherine. A baby can't sleep in the living room. You'll move out and sleep on the sofa. I froze. The sofa? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my voice. You're kicking me out of my own bedroom? It's not kicking you out, Mom said, shaking her head as if I were the unreasonable one. It's just that you can sacrifice a little for your brother's family. Sarah placed David in his bassinet and glanced at me with a fake smile. We really appreciate this, Catherine. This is a difficult time for us. I looked at her. I looked at Thomas. I looked at my parents. Then I turned toward the bedroom. The room I had worked so hard to have. A week ago, it was mine. Now, I was being pushed onto the couch in the very apartment I was still paying rent for. I had endured unfair treatment many times in my life, but this was the final straw. The following days were a nightmare. Every morning, I woke up to David's piercing cries. If it wasn't his crying, it was the endless arguments between Thomas and Sarah about money. They had no jobs, no plans, and no intention of changing their situation. Thomas spent his days lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Sarah constantly complained about how exhausting it was to take care of a baby, yet she never lifted a finger to help with household chores. Everything fell on me: the utility bills, the groceries, the basic upkeep of the apartment. I tried reminding them. I tried having a conversation. But my words were dismissed every single time. "We're going through a tough time," Thomas would say, not even glancing up from his screen. "Families should support each other," Mom would scold, as if I were the cruel one for asking for fairness. And every day when I returned home after long hours of work, I found my apartment in complete disarray: children's toys scattered everywhere, dirty clothes piled up, dishes overflowing in the sink. No one cleaned. No one cared that I was still the only one paying rent. I was no longer the owner of this apartment. I was just a stranger, forced into the role of an unwilling sponsor for my family. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, just as I walked through the door, I saw my mother waiting for me. "Catherine, we need to talk." I tossed my bag onto the couch, trying to suppress my exhaustion. "What now?" Mom took a sip of her tea and spoke slowly, as if she were delivering good news. "Your father and I have decided to increase the rent for the apartment." I froze. "What?" "With more people living here, the utility bills and living expenses have increased. So we think it's only fair for you to contribute more." I let out a bitter laugh. "And what will Thomas contribute?" Mom shrugged. "Thomas is going through a rough time. He can't afford to pay right now." I looked at her, then around the apartment, this place where I had been reduced to a stranger. And at that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting them use me. I needed to get out. I thought I had grown used to my family's unfair treatment. But even I hadn't expected them to take it this far. That night, when Mom announced I would have to pay double rent to support the family, I was suspicious, but I had no proof, until I heard them admit it with my own ears. After a long, exhausting day at work, I returned to the apartment, the place I was supposed to call home, but had long stopped feeling like one. I opened the door to find Thomas sprawled on the couch, his legs kicked up on the table like he had never known responsibility. Sarah sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, while David slept peacefully in his crib. I walked into the kitchen to grab a drink, trying to ignore their presence. And then, I heard it. The words that made my blood run cold. "I can't believe she's still paying," Sarah giggled. "Honestly, this is even easier than I thought." "Told you," Thomas replied smugly. "Catherine wouldn't dare do anything. She always does whatever Mom and Dad tell her." I stood there, frozen. Sarah's voice lowered, but the smugness remained. "What about the rent money your parents take from her? I heard Mom say they still send us half of it every month." Thomas laughed, a sound that made my stomach turn. "Yeah, this is great. No rent, free place to stay, and extra cash in our pockets. How long do you think it'll take for Catherine to realize she's just a fool, being used?" I gripped the glass in my hand tightly. So this was the truth. Not only was I being forced to pay double rent, but that money was going straight into Thomas and Sarah's pockets. They had no idea I was standing nearby. They didn't know I had heard everything. But I knew. And at that moment, I decided I wasn't going to put up with this for another second. I was leaving. Tonight. I walked straight into the bedroom, the room that had once been mine but now bore the marks of someone else. Sarah's paintings, Thomas's clothes, David's toys. Every single thing in that space reminded me that I no longer belonged here. I opened the closet and pulled out the biggest suitcase I had. I didn't need much, just the essentials. I stuffed in a few sets of clothes, my laptop, and the small jewelry box my grandmother had given me. The rest? I didn't care anymore. When I zipped up the suitcase, it felt as though a weight had been lifted off my chest. I no longer felt hesitation or fear. I was leaving, and I wasn't coming back. Opening my laptop, I searched for a new apartment faster than I ever thought possible. I had considered this move many times but had never taken action. But now, after hearing the truth, there was nothing left to hold me back. It took less than an hour to find the perfect place. A one-bedroom apartment. Clean, quiet, just a 15-minute walk from my job. No more invaded privacy. No more being the family's ATM. I called the landlord immediately. "I want to rent the apartment. Can I move in right away?" A woman's voice answered. "You can come see it now if you'd like." I didn't need to see it, I just needed to go. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I stepped out of the bedroom, dragging my suitcase behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. Thomas was still on the couch, but this time he looked up, frowning. "Catherine, what are you doing?" I didn't stop. "Moving out." Sarah lifted her head from her phone, raising an eyebrow. "What?" I pulled my suitcase through the living room without looking at them. I said, "I'm leaving. Right now." Thomas shot up from the couch. "Catherine, stop joking, you can't just leave." I stopped at the door and turned to look him straight in the eye. "Watch me." His mouth fell open, but no words came out. I opened the door and stepped outside. No goodbyes, no looking back. That night, I walked into my new apartment. The landlord handed me the keys, I signed the lease, and she left. I stood in the empty living room, my suitcase beside me. No more crying babies, no more fights, no more demands for money. Just silence. I sank down onto the floor, leaning against the wall. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning my phone buzzed non-stop, calls from Mom, messages from Thomas. A voice in my head told me that if I answered, they would try to pull me back in. I pressed the block button. I was no longer their fool. They would have to take care of themselves, for the first time in their lives. And me? I would live the life I deserved. No one could take that away from me anymore. 3 days after I left, my phone started ringing non-stop. Thomas. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I had predicted their reaction the moment I walked out of that apartment. First, there would be panic, then anger, followed by guilt, tripping. They wouldn't accept that I had left without permission. That I had dared to do something they never thought I was capable of. Freeing myself. I sat in my new apartment, sipping a hot cup of coffee, enjoying a peace I had never known before. No more crying babies, no more demands, no more feeling trapped in my own home. But then, a message popped up on my screen, making me laugh. A cold, hollow laugh, devoid of any emotion for them. "Mom, Catherine, do you really think you can just walk away like this?" I set my coffee down on the table. A few seconds later, another message came through. "Mom, you haven't sent this month's rent yet. Your father and I are struggling, because Thomas and Sarah still don't have jobs. You can't just abandon your family like this." I stared at the screen, considering my response. Then, I made my decision. I wasn't going to pay another cent. I opened the message and typed a simple reply. "I'm no longer responsible for that apartment. It belongs to Thomas now. I'm sure he'll figure it out. Best of luck." I hit send and immediately blocked the number. This was over. The following weeks passed in complete silence. No calls, no messages, no threats. I didn't know if they had truly given up or if they were just trying to find a new way to pull me back in, but I didn't care anymore. I poured all my energy into work. Without the weight of my family holding me down, I was able to fully focus on my career, and it paid off quickly. 2 months after leaving, I was promoted. My salary doubled. The company gave me my own office. I signed a long-term lease for my new apartment, decorated it exactly the way I wanted, and for the first time, had a space that truly felt like my own. I spent my weekends exploring the city, trying out cafes I had never had the time to visit before. I joined a yoga class, met new people, expanded my social circle. Life had never been better. I no longer thought about my family. I no longer cared what they thought, wanted, or expected from me. They were no longer my problem. 3 months later, a former colleague casually mentioned Thomas. "I heard your brother is looking for a job," he said as we sipped coffee in the break room. Seems like he's struggling a bit. I raised an eyebrow, unable to hide my amusement. Oh, is that so? He nodded. A friend of mine in HR said he's been sending out applications everywhere, but no one's hiring him. Having a failed business on his record. Well, companies don't want to take that risk. I simply smiled, taking another sip of my coffee. Well, that's unfortunate. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to know. But a few days later, I heard another update. This time from my grandmother. She was the only family member I still kept in touch with. Even though I never asked about Thomas or my parents, she would occasionally tell me what was going on. They're in a tough situation, Grandma said, her voice filled with both sympathy and disappointment. Thomas still hasn't found a job. Sarah does nothing but complain. And your parents? They're exhausted. I simply nodded, showing no reaction. But then she said something that actually made me laugh. Sarah is pregnant again. I set my teacup down, my expression unshaken. Really? She nodded. Yes. And your parents are trying to figure out how to help them again. I shook my head. That's not my problem. Grandma sighed. You really don't want to help at all? I looked straight into her eyes, my voice firmer than ever. Though they had chosen this path. They had chosen to favor Thomas. To believe that I would always be there to save them. But they were wrong. I stood up, kissed her cheek and said, I have to go now. Thank you for talking to me. She gave me a sad smile. As long as you're happy, that's all that matters. And for the first time in my life, I truly was. Not because I had gotten revenge. Not because I had proven anything to my parents. But because I had let them go. No more anger, no more resentment. Just my own life, a life I could finally live on my own terms. And no matter how Thomas, Sarah, or my parents managed, it was no longer my concern. Catherine's story is not just a tale of family betrayal, it is a testament to the power of independence and personal boundaries. She was used, overlooked, and taken for granted. But instead of resigning herself to that fate, she had the courage to step away from the toxic cycle and choose her own life. This is an important lesson in real life. No one is obligated to carry the burdens of others, especially those who only seek to take advantage. Setting boundaries, protecting your self-worth, and learning to walk away from toxic relationships are essential for a happy and peaceful life. Catherine's story is a powerful reminder of the value of independence and personal boundaries. What do you think about how she handled her family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more compelling stories about family and life.